Just a temp nurse. That's what they called her. Nobody knew the woman unloading a cardboard box of belongings at the Seattle General Nurse Station in Denver had commanded a reconnaissance element through the San Juan Valley, or that her hands had held together more lives than the entire staff would see in a decade. Rachel Torres didn't volunteer this information. She simply smiled when the unit secretary offered her a lukewarm cup of vending machine coffee, accepted the oversized scrubs 2 sizes too big, and clipped her temporary badge to her collar with the kind of efficiency that made efficient people uncomfortable. What they didn't know was that she'd walked into Seattle General at 6:22 a.m. on a Monday with a single objective, and it had nothing to do with nursing. The veteran in room 347 had commanded her son's unit in Baghdad. He was still alive because of decisions she'd made in a sandstorm that should have killed them all. And now he was here, 3 floors above the ground, mute and breaking apart one vital sign at a time, and the hospital didn't even know they had a legend walking their corridors in scrubs that hung like a disguise. Dr. Mercer noticed her during the morning briefing. Not because she spoke, she didn't, but because of the way she didn't. While the other nurses crowded around the assignment board, Rachel stood 3 feet back, scanning the room like she was mapping exits. Corner first, her eyes moving to the double doors, then the supply closet, then the narrow window overlooking the parking lot. Her fingers traced the edge of her charting clipboard with the precision of someone running a systems check. When an orderly bumped into her near the med cart, she didn't flinch. She simply stepped aside with the kind of spatial awareness that belonged in a military installation, not a hospital floor. Mercer's jaw tightened. There was something theatrical about military bearing in a civilian setting, the way it made everyone else look like they were moving underwater. She moved like water moving fast. The first 3 hours established a pattern he found increasingly irritating. A patient in 316 mentioned to Mercer that Rachel had caught an error in his own medication order, a benzodiazepine dose that would have dropped the patient's respiratory rate below safety threshold. Mercer had written it at 2:15 a.m., a mistake any physician made, the kind of thing that should have been absorbed without comment. Instead, the patient was grateful. The orderly who'd thanked her in the hallway had used the word professional, which was accurate, which was the problem. She'd earned that respect without the credentials he controlled, without the medical degree framed in mahogany, without the 15-year trajectory through the hospital system that Mercer had engineered with meticulous politics and 3 consecutive department directorships. She had earned it in 72 hours by simply not making mistakes and actually listening when patients spoke. By noon, Mercer had convinced himself something was wrong with her references. Nobody was this competent on a first assignment. Nobody moved through a hospital floor with this kind of confident precision unless they'd been doing it for years, and her file said this was her first temp placement in Denver. Her reference is vague and institutional, a regional medical cooperative with a phone line that barely rang. He made a note, verify credentials. Not because he believed anything was actually wrong, but because he needed to understand why his own authority felt diminished when she charted medications with penmanship so precise it looked like typography, why residents actually paused when she suggested a different medication regimen, why she'd somehow become the person patients asked for when they needed help, even though she'd been in the building for less than a week. Rachel spent her break in room 347. The mute veteran lay in the bed like a problem the hospital hadn't learned how to solve yet. Commander James Holloway. 28 years in the Special Forces. 17 citations. 2 Purple Hearts and a Bronze Star that had never been processed through proper channels because the mission that earned it still lived in a classification above his pay grade. He'd stopped speaking 3 months after his discharge, the doctors said. Selective mutism. Trauma response. The kind of diagnosis that meant nobody here knew how to actually help him, so they decided he wasn't trying. Non-compliant, they charted. Difficult. Mercer had written in the notes that Holloway was probably malingering, using his silence as leverage for attention, and that speech therapy was a waste of resources until he was willing to engage with treatment. Rachel sat on the edge of his bed without asking permission, the way people do when they've already made a decision about what kindness looks like. She didn't speak to him. She simply sat in the fluorescent quiet, hands folded in her lap, her presence the kind of calm that comes from having already survived the worst. After 4 minutes, Holloway's eyes moved toward her, not much, just a shift in his pupils, but enough. She nodded once. She stood, pressed 2 fingers to her lips, then touched them to her heart. A gesture. An acknowledgement. Then she was gone, back to the floor, back to charting, back to moving through the hospital with the terrifying fluid precision of someone who'd learned long ago that every action mattered. But Mercer had seen it. He'd been walking past room 347, had caught that gesture through the window, had watched her touch her own heart in response to a man who hadn't spoken in 90 days. And something about that simple exchange made his hands form fists at his sides. She didn't have authority to make that kind of clinical judgment. Silent observation was observation. Non-verbal communication with a psychiatric patient required documentation, protocol, supervision. She was moving through his hospital as if she already owned it, as if she understood something about Holloway that the discharge summaries and psychiatric evaluations didn't contain, as if her presence in that room had been a form of treatment nobody had authorized. He would find out who she really was. It was only a matter of applying pressure in the right places. Rachel's locker was in the basement break room, number 47, wedged between a water cooler that hadn't been serviced in 3 weeks and the employee time clock. She opened it at 4:52 p.m., 18 minutes before her shift ended, and the fluorescent light hummed its electric song above her head. Her scrubs hung on the hook. Her shoes were lined up precisely. And there, in the corner of the locker, was the folded flag. 13 stars arranged in a triangle, the fabric old enough that the blue had faded to the color of old denim, the edges sealed with a precision that only comes from someone who understands what flags mean, what they weigh, what you owe the people they represent. She touched it with her left hand, her fingers tracing the fold line where it had been creased for 14 years. The scar on her wrist caught the light, a thick white line running from her palm almost to her elbow, the kind of scar that appears in medical textbooks as an example of severe arterial damage that shouldn't be compatible with full hand function. But her hands functioned perfectly. They always did. The flag had belonged to Sergeant Marcus Chen, 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines, Dark Horse Company, the man who died holding a perimeter while Rachel and Commander Holloway got 37 soldiers out of a burning convoy. He died so her son wouldn't die. He died so Holloway could come home to a sister and a nephew. And every morning before her shift, she touched this flag and made a promise to the 13 stars that the people she'd sworn to protect would stay alive, would get better, would find a reason to speak again even if speaking cost them everything. She folded her fingers into a fist, still touching the fabric, and then she closed the locker door with a quiet click. The sound echoed slightly in the empty break room. Fluorescent light. Vending machines. The smell of stale coffee and the industrial cleaner the night shift used to mop these corridors. She had 14 days to make Dr. Mercer understand why Holloway mattered. 14 days before her cover required her to disappear, before some administrative rotation would move her to a different hospital in a different city, before the military intelligence handler who'd placed her here would call with her next assignment. 14 days to give Holloway enough stability, enough human connection, enough proof that someone remembered who he'd been before silence became his only weapon. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was knowing that Mercer had already decided she didn't belong here, that he was already moving pieces, already calling people, already making the kinds of phone calls that end careers. And she had no way to stop him without revealing exactly what she was protecting and who. She clipped her badge back to her collar and walked upstairs toward the evening shift, her hand steady, her jaw tight, her voice already prepared for whatever came next. Thursday morning arrived with fluorescent light and the smell of antiseptic so thick it coated the back of Rachel's throat. The Grand Rounds conference room had filled 20 minutes early, residents packed shoulder to shoulder, anticipating Dr. Mercer's usual performance. He stood at the podium like an actor waiting for his curtain, and when he saw Rachel slip in through the rear door, his smile widened. "Ah, perfect timing," Mercer said, his voice carrying the false warmth of a predator. "Class, I want to discuss documentation standards. Or rather, the complete absence of them." He clicked to the first slide. Rachel's charting filled the projection screen, her handwriting precise, clinical, exact. He began to read aloud, his tone shifting to mockery. "Patient remains non-verbal, vital sign stable, wound dressing changed per protocol." He paused, letting silence hang. This is the kind of dangerously substandard work we get from nurses who purchase their licenses online. 3-day shipping from some diploma mill in Nevada. Laughter rippled through the residence like a wave. One of the third years actually snorted. Mercer continued, his theatrical delivery gaining momentum. Each were designed to lacerate. Notice the lack of specificity. Notice the absence of clinical reasoning. This is what happens when we hire temporary staff without proper vetting. It's a liability waiting to happen. Rachel stood against the back wall, her jaw clenching so tight a muscle jumped beneath her skin. Her hands were clasped behind her back at parade rest, that automatic military posture she never quite shed, and her face remained absolutely empty. Not the emptiness of someone wounded, but the emptiness of someone who had catalogued every word, every face, every laugh, and filed them away in a place where they could be retrieved later with perfect clarity. Her eyes didn't even flicker. Mercer watched for a reaction, hunting for any sign of distress. He found none. Thank you all for this teaching moment, Mercer concluded, clicking to his next slide. Vigilance. That's what separates hospitals from warehouses. The room transitioned back to the scheduled presentation, but the damage was done. The residents had their talking points. The hierarchy had been re-established. Rachel turned and walked out before the applause had fully died. The vending machine on the third floor occupied a corner alcove near the staff bathroom. Rachel pushed coins into the slot on Friday afternoon, her shift just beginning, the hospital still in that quiet lull between lunch and afternoon rush. 2 nurses stood at the machine beside her, Jessica from night shift and Morrison from pediatrics. They'd both said hello to Rachel the previous week. Now they stared straight ahead as if she'd become invisible. Did you hear? Jessica's voice carried that specific pitch designed to be overheard. 3 hospitals. Fired from 3 different hospitals for negligence. Amham, Morrison answered, her tone dripping with manufactured concern. And her references? Apparently her cousin answered the phone at the last place. Rachel's coffee tumbled into the dispenser slot. She retrieved it, the paper cup warm against her palm. Black. No sugar. The way soldiers learn to drink it, functional, not pleasant. I wouldn't trust her to chart a vital sign, Jessica continued, still not looking directly at Rachel. She probably bought her credentials online. Rachel selected her snack with the deliberation of someone defusing a bomb. M&M's peanut. She fed coins into the slot and waited for the spiral to rotate. The M&M's dropped. She collected them without a word. That's when Mercer appeared, walking alongside hospital security, his posture radiating casual authority. He saw Rachel standing there and smiled, a smile like a shark recognizing blood in the water. Oh, speaking of credentials, he said to the security officer, loud enough for everyone in a 10-foot radius to hear, someone should verify that badge isn't counterfeit. We can't be too careful with patient safety, right? These temporary placement agencies don't always do thorough background checks. Rachel tucked the M&Ms into her scrub pocket. She didn't turn around. She didn't acknowledge the comment. She didn't allow her breathing to change. She simply walked toward the stairwell, her pace exactly the same as it would have been if she'd heard nothing at all. But her hands knew the truth. In room 347, Commander Holloway lay in his hospital bed, his eyes tracking her entrance with the precision of someone still scanning for threats. She changed his dressing, recorded his vitals, BP 118/72, O2 sat 96%, heart rate 62, slow and controlled like a man trained to manage his own physiology. She didn't speak. He didn't try. That evening, the station nurses were brutal in their performance of casual cruelty. Rachel sat charting while 3 nurses gathered at the desk behind her, their whispers pitched just loud enough. Google nurse. One of them giggled at her own joke. Did you see her hand shake when Mercer read her notes? Another voice. A lie, but told with such confidence that someone would absolutely believe it. I heard she left 2 patients on their own during her shifts. That's why she got fired. Rachel's fingers moved across the keyboard, her charting continuing without interruption. One patient encounter after another documented with surgical precision. Every vital sign recorded. Every intervention noted. Every observation catalogued. Her documentation was so obsessively detailed it could have served as a medical textbook. She knew Mercer was reviewing everything, hunting for anything that might resemble negligence. She left him nothing. When her shift ended at midnight, the supply closet in the West Wing had become her sanctuary. Rachel pulled the door closed, breathing in the sharp smell of bleach and acetone, surrounded by boxes of gauze and 4 tubing. She pressed her forehead against the cool metal shelving, and for exactly 90 seconds she let her breathing go irregular. 4 counts in. 4 counts out. The pattern they'd taught during combat stress training at Fort Bragg 8 years ago, when she was still Captain Torres instead of Nurse Google and temp staff, and the kind of woman 2 nurses would refuse to acknowledge. 4 counts in. 4 counts out. In her car in the parking lot at 1:38 a.m., rain hammering the windshield like accusations, Rachel pulled her personal phone from the glove compartment. Not her hospital phone. Not her personal phone. The encrypted satellite phone that looked like nothing and everything, buried beneath a broken sunshade and a road atlas from 2016. A text message waited in the secure channel, mission status report required. Patient cannot be transferred until medically stable. Maintain cover. She'd known this was coming. The message was standard protocol, but reading it still sent a current through her chest. Commander Holloway was deteriorating in room 347, his breathing becoming shallower, his chart showing signs that Mercer had dismissed as baseline for his condition rather than the slow decline of a man whose body was beginning to fail. Pneumonia was developing in his lower left lobe. She documented it 3 times. Nobody was reading her notes carefully enough to notice. The investigation was accelerating. Mercer had made phone calls, she could sense it in the way HR staff suddenly avoided eye contact, in the way the nursing director had started watching her with the expression of someone tasked with an unpleasant job. Yesterday, the director had mentioned something about rotation needs and suggested Rachel might be better suited to a different floor. A different floor meant losing access to room 347. A different floor meant mission failure. Rachel typed her response with 2-fingered military precision, cover intact. Patient stable. No transfer required. It was a lie. The second she hit send, she knew it was a lie. Commander Holloway's oxygen saturation had been dropping incrementally for 3 days. His breathing had the quality of something struggling against invisible weight. And Dr. Mercer had ordered her off his care rotation effective Monday. She sat in the car while rain drummed the roof like Morse code, her hands gripping the steering wheel, her jaw locked so tight her molars ached. In her locker at the hospital was a folded flag, 13 stars in a triangle, the memorial from a teammate who died holding a perimeter in Baghdad while Rachel and 12 other soldiers made it out. She touched that flag before every shift, a ritual so private that nobody had ever noticed. Nobody knew what she was protecting. Nobody knew that the man in room 347 had commanded her convoy in 2011 when an IED struck the 3rd vehicle. Nobody knew he'd stayed behind, bleeding through body armor, while she and 8 others ran toward the LZAID. Nobody knew that she'd spent for years after that deployment hunting through VA hospitals and recovery centers, trying to find him, trying to repay a debt she could never actually repay. And now she was going to lose him because Dr. Mercer had decided that a temporary nurse from an agency was a convenient target. Rachel pulled out of the parking lot at 2:15 a.m., heading toward her apartment across the city, her mind already shifting into the next problem, how to prevent her rotation off the floor without revealing that she had any reason to care. How to maintain cover while watching a man's pneumonia progress. How to be in 2 places at once, the invisible nurse that Mercer despised and the soldier that Holloway needed. The rain followed her all the way home, and somewhere in the hospital behind her, the night shift nurses were probably still laughing about the credential she'd never paid for, the license that was more real than the identity they'd assigned her. The next morning, Rachel found a note in her locker, written in block letters on a hospital memo pad, "You don't belong here." She read it once. Folded it into a perfect square. and placed it on top of the folded flag, a memorial beside a memorial, in a locker that held more secrets than most people carried in an entire lifetime. Wednesday, 2:53 p.m. Shift change at Seattle General. Rachel pushed through the double doors toward room 347, her shoes whispering against the linoleum, muscle memory moving her through hallways she'd walked 1,000 times. The day shift was handing off, nurses clustered at the station comparing notes, residents reviewing charts with the distracted focus of people who'd been awake for 36 hours. Nobody looked at her. That was fine. That was always fine. She reached the veteran's room and opened the door. The first thing she saw was the color. Wrong color. His lips were blue, not the pale blue of exhaustion but the deep cyanotic blue of a body starving for oxygen. His neck veins distended like cables, his trachea shifted visibly to the right. She didn't need to check a monitor. She didn't need to call for help. Tension pneumothorax. Air trapped in the pleural space, pressure collapsing the lung, compressing the heart. The kind of emergency that killed people in under 4 minutes if you hesitated. The kind of emergency that required precision. Rachel moved. Not quickly. Deliberately. The covering resident, some third-year named Chen, stood frozen at the foot of the bed with a phone hanging from his hand like a dead thing. His mouth was open. His eyes darted between the veteran and his phone as if the device might suddenly explain what to do with a patient whose oxygen saturation was dropping so fast the monitor couldn't keep pace. 94, 87. 79, the numbers fell like a countdown. Rachel crossed to the crash cart in 4 strides and opened the top drawer. Her hands knew exactly what they needed before her brain finished thinking it. 14-gauge angiocath needle. She prepped the site, second intercostal space, mid-clavicular line, with the efficiency of muscle memory that had practiced this procedure in the back of a Humvee 3,000 miles away, under conditions far worse than a sterile hospital room. Her hands didn't shake. Her breathing didn't change. The tremor that most people would feel, that adrenaline spike that made people clumsy, didn't touch her. It never did. "I'm calling a code," Chen stammered, finally lifting the phone. "Don't." Rachel's voice was flat. Matter of fact. Not a suggestion. "Watch." She positioned the needle perpendicular to the chest wall. Applied pressure. The pop was immediate, the distinctive hiss of air escaping the pleural space, months of accumulated pressure releasing in a single breath. The sound was like opening a sealed container, like letting something trapped finally escape. Around her, the machines began their correction. The monitor beeped. O2 sat climbed, 79. 84, 91. The veteran's color shifted from that terrible blue to something closer to human. His neck veins depressed. His trachea drifted back to the midline. His breathing deepened. 90 seconds. That's all it took. The crash cart needle, the precise angle, the location exact to the millimeter, every movement had been calibrated by someone who'd held a dying man's ribs open in a combat forward operating base, who understood that hesitation was a luxury combat medics couldn't afford. She secured the catheter with practiced efficiency and stepped back, her hands utterly steady as she made notes on the chart. The resident stared at her as if she'd just explained calculus in a language he didn't speak. "How did you?" Chen's voice cracked. "That's not in a med-surg nurse's scope." Rachel didn't look at him. She continued charting, her handwriting precise and controlled, each letter formed with the care of someone who understood that documentation mattered, that details saved lives, that a chart was a legal record, and she'd just performed a procedure that existed in a gray zone between nursing protocol and practicing medicine without a license. The room was quiet except for the monitor's steady beeping and the faint hiss of the oxygen flowing through the veteran's nasal cannula. Outside the room, the shift change continued. Nurses laughed at the station. Phones rang. The hospital moved forward like nothing had changed. But Rachel knew. The veteran's pupils were reactive again. His skin tone was returning. His fingers gripped the bed rail weakly, a movement that hadn't been possible 2 minutes ago. He couldn't speak, hadn't spoken since arrival, but his eyes found hers and held. Recognition. Understanding. In that single moment, no words were necessary. She'd just done what she was trained to do. What she'd been sent here to do. Dr. Mercer arrived 7 minutes later. She heard his voice before she saw him, that distinctive sharp cadence that preceded him like a warning. He was speaking to someone on the phone, his tone carrying the particular brightness of a man performing competence for an audience. He ended the call as he entered the room, and his eyes moved directly to the chart Rachel was still completing. She watched his face as he scanned the page. Watched the moment he understood what she'd done. His jaw tightened. His breathing deepened. The brightness in his voice evaporated, replaced by something colder, something that sounded like a predator recognizing a threat. "Step outside," he said to Chen. Not a request. A command. When the resident had gone, Mercer's voice dropped to something barely above a whisper. "You just practice medicine without a license. Do you understand what you've done? Do you have any idea what I'm going to do with this information?" Rachel said nothing. She continued her charting, her pen steady, her composure a wall of glass that reflected his anger without absorbing it. The veteran watched from the bed, his breathing gradually stabilizing, his crisis already becoming past tense. Mercer pulled her into the hallway. His hands didn't touch her, but his voice cut like a blade. "I'm calling the chief medical officer. I'm calling the state licensing board. I'm calling the hospital's legal counsel. I'm calling the DEA because this is fraud, this is endangerment, and I have documentation of every single moment of your incompetence." He was walking toward the nurse's station now, moving with the momentum of a man who'd spent 15 years cultivating exactly this kind of network, people who owed him, people who answered his calls, people who would move when Dr. Mercer moved. He picked up the phone at the station. His voice rose just enough to carry. Just enough for people to hear. Not shouting, that would be unprofessional. But loud enough. Clear enough. The word spread like a stain, "I need to speak with legal immediately. I've discovered a serious breach of clinical protocol." "Yes. Immediately." Rachel returned to the chart. Her hands remained steady. Around her, the energy of the station shifted subtly. Heads turned. Eyes lingered. She caught the gaze of one of the nurses who turned her back at the vending machine, Sylvia, 2 weeks ago, deliberately ignoring her. Now Sylvia's expression was different. Uncertainty. Questions. The whisper campaign had been working perfectly until about 90 seconds ago, when Rachel had performed a procedure that no standard med-surg nurse should have executed with such precision. The next morning, an email arrived in Rachel's hospital account at 6:38 a.m. Subject line, urgent, suspension pending investigation. She read it twice. Skimmed the language, unauthorized medical procedures, breach of scope of practice, immediate suspension, investigation by state licensing board, recommendation for termination. The email was from the chief medical officer's office, but the architecture was pure Mercer. He'd already made his calls. He'd already activated his network. He'd already positioned himself as the guardian who'd caught a dangerous imposter before she harmed someone. Rachel looked at the clock. Her shift started at 7 a.m. She showered. She put on her scrubs. She drove to Seattle General through Denver Street still wet from an overnight rain, the asphalt steaming in the early light like something alive. The hospital looked the same as it always did, the same brick facade, the same entrance, the same security badge that would probably still work until someone decided otherwise. She parked in the same spot. She walked through the same doors. The nurses at the station saw her coming. One of them immediately stood. Another looked away. Mercer wasn't on the morning shift, but his presence was everywhere, in the way people watched her, in the space that opened around her like water avoiding an oil slick, in the silence that followed her down the hallway toward room 347. The veteran was awake. Alert. His color was normal. His breathing was stable. The needle decompression had held. Whatever damage the tension pneumothorax had caused, whatever complications might develop, she'd given him 48 more hours. 72 more hours. Maybe a lifetime, if the chest tube that had been placed overnight held, if the collapsed lung re-expanded, if no infection set in. She began her assessment. Vitals. Breath sounds. Pupil response. The clinical routine that grounded her, the ritual that kept her sane when everything else was collapsing. The veteran's eyes tracked her movements with an intensity that suggested he understood more than his silence revealed. He'd been trained by the same military that had trained her. He'd learned the same discipline. Say nothing unless it matters. Don't reveal what you don't need to reveal. By midday, the hospital's legal team would have reviewed the charting. By afternoon, they'd have consulted with the state licensing board. By evening, Rachel's suspension would be finalized. By tomorrow, her temporary assignment at Seattle General would be history, and a woman who'd been sent here by military intelligence to monitor a former Special Forces commander would be forced to walk away from her post. She didn't know yet. But she would know within hours. For now, she was still a nurse at Seattle General. She was still in room 347. And the man who'd commanded her unit in Baghdad was still breathing because of the 90 seconds when she stopped pretending to be ordinary and became, instead, exactly what she'd always been. A warrior. A medic. Someone trained for moments when the difference between death and survival measured in seconds, and the people who hesitated didn't get to make the choice about who lived and who died. The choice was made for them, carved out by their own fear. Rachel Torres had never been afraid of anything in her life. And that, Dr. Mercer was about to discover, was a problem he'd underestimated from the very beginning. Dr. Mercer's hands trembled as he gripped the chart. Not from fear. From rage. The needle decompression was executed with a kind of precision that didn't belong in a med-surg nurse's skill set. 14-gauge catheter, second intercostal space, mid-clavicular line. The O2 sat climbing from 68 to 94 in 90 seconds. Clean. Confident. Impossible. He'd spent 15 years building a network of allies. The chief medical officer owed him 3 favors. The board chairman had attended his daughter's wedding. 2 colleagues at the state licensing bureau would take his call at midnight. He made those calls at 11:38 p.m. I need an investigation opened on a staff nurse, he said to each of them. Credentials appear fraudulent. She performed an advanced procedure beyond her scope today. I have documentation. By 6 a.m., an investigator named Patricia Voss was in the personnel office with Rachel's employment file spread across a table. She made phone calls. Rachel's previous employers received questions carefully worded to confirm incompetence. Did she ever perform procedures outside standard nursing protocols? Was there ever concern about medication errors? Any complaints about her judgment during patient care? The voices on the other end hesitated, not because they had doubts, but because the questions were designed to plant them. Mercer arrived at the chief medical officer's office at 7:15 a.m. with the chart in hand. That needle decompression was textbook perfect, he said, his voice steady with manufactured concern. Which means she has training she didn't disclose. Military training, possibly. Which raises the question, who vetted her? Where did she really work? I've already had inconsistencies flagged by 3 previous employers. The CMO's jaw tightened. Mercer continued, his voice dropping to a confessional tone. I'm not saying she's malicious. But we almost let someone unvetted perform trauma interventions on one of our patients. What if next time she guesses wrong? What if next time someone dies? By 9:44 a.m., the hospital's credentialing office had issued a suspension pending investigation. Rachel's badge was flagged. She was reassigned to administrative duties, barred from the floor. By 10 a.m., security was walking her down the corridor with a cardboard box balanced against her hip, her belongings reduced to what could fit in 600 cubic inches. A cracked coffee mug with a faded Marines insignia, the enamel worn smooth from hands that had held it through deployments. A half-dead succulent she'd been nursing back to health for 2 months, its leaves yellowed and drooping. And a photo in a plastic frame, the one she kept in her locker beneath extra compression bandages and replacement gloves. Her son Marcus at 16 in marine dress blues, standing at parade rest beside the commanding officer of his unit, Colonel James Whitmore, the same man now lying 3 floors above her in room 347, breathing through Rachel's intervention, alive because she'd acted while everyone else froze. She didn't walk fast. She didn't walk slow. She walked with the same mechanical precision she brought to every 12-hour shift, her rubber-soled shoes clicking against hospital tile with metronomic consistency. Nurses at the station watched her pass. Some turned away. Others smirked. Mercer stood near the pharmacy counter, his arms crossed, speaking to the chief medical officer in a voice loud enough to carry, "This is what happens when we don't implement proper verification protocols. The system failed to catch someone operating outside their credentials, and we're fortunate it didn't result in a patient fatality." Rachel didn't slow down. Her face remained the color of cool granite. The automatic doors hissed open. Cold Denver air hit her face, carrying the smell of wet asphalt and diesel exhaust from the loading dock. Rain hammered the parking lot like applause nobody wanted. She walked to the bus stop 2 blocks away, her shoe soaked through by the time she reached it, cardboard box softening against her lap as water began seeping through the bottom. The succulent tilted sideways. A drop of rain hit the plastic frame, obscuring Marcus's face. Rachel stared at the blurred image of her son, unable to move her hand to wipe the water away. That evening, she sat in her apartment in near-complete darkness, the termination letter spread across her kitchen table alongside the secured phone that kept buzzing with messages from handlers she'd trained herself not to answer. The secure phone was protocol. The messages would be instructions, status updates, reassignments. Her fingers didn't reach for it. Instead, she stared at the termination letter's closing paragraph, effective immediately. Your employment with Seattle General is terminated for misrepresentation of credentials and violation of nursing scope of practice. All future employment references will note this termination. Her mission objective had been simple: maintain cover at Seattle General, monitor Asset Nightingale, the mute colonel in room 347, and ensure his security while he recovered from the classified briefing injuries that brought him to Denver. The briefing had gone wrong. An IED strike in Baghdad. The colonel knew things. Classified things. Things that got people killed. Her orders were to keep him alive. Protected. Invisible. Everything was proceeding according to plan. Except plans don't account for Dr. Mercer. The apartment door burst open. Marcus stood in the doorway, rain plastering his dark hair to his forehead, holding something wrapped in black velvet. He was 17 now, a year from his Marine contract, already moving with the deliberate precision of someone who'd been shaped by discipline. He was holding a shadow box. "Mom, they fired you because they don't know who you are," he said, his voice carrying the kind of absolute certainty that belonged to teenagers and soldiers. "They need to see these." He opened the case. 2 bronze stars. A Purple Heart. A Navy Cross. Medals with ribbons in colors that had meaning only to people who understood what blood looked like under desert sun. Rachel stood up, her hand moving toward him in an automatic gesture of control. "Marcus, you don't understand." "I can't," her voice cracked. The first crack in 17 years. "I can't let you do this. This isn't, Mom." He held the shadow box against his chest. "You taught me about honor. You taught me that truth is worth more than cover. You taught me that when someone needs help, you don't walk away just because it's complicated." He was already moving toward the door. Already reaching for his keys. "I'm going to the hospital. I'm going to show them who you are." Rachel sat alone in darkness, her palms pressed against her eyes, feeling the tremor in her shoulders that had nothing to do with cold. The mission was compromised. Her cover was about to detonate. And somewhere in the basement of Pentagon operations, people in uniforms would be making calls about asset security and operational exposure. She touched the folded flag in her pocket, the one from Baghdad, the one with 13 stars representing the teammate who died holding the perimeter while her convoy got clear. Some covers were worth burning. Some people were worth the risk. But Colonel Whitmore didn't deserve to be exposed because of her failure to contain a threat named Mercer. FBI agents escorted Dr. Mercer from the conference room as he sputtered about his rights, his reputation, his entire life collapsing in real time. His phone calls to discredit Rachel had triggered a federal records review. Every reference he contacted, every board member he influenced, every investigator he activated now catalogued as evidence of interference with a classified military operation. But the review uncovered something far worse. 6 years of forged patient charts. Fabricated research data. Falsified outcomes reports that Mercer had created to build his reputation and secure grant funding from the National Institutes of Health. The FBI presented a binder 3 inches thick, each page a carefully documented lie. His office was sealed with yellow crime scene tape, his files seized by federal agents in dark suits, his hospital privileges immediately revoked by a chief medical officer whose hands trembled as she signed the order. The state medical board received a criminal referral. The DEA cross-referenced his controlled substance logs, 18 months of discrepancies in narcotic dispensing, all traceable to Mercer's signature. Nurses who turned their backs on Rachel at the vending machine now couldn't meet her eyes in the hallway. The nursing director who drafted the rotation orders to remove Rachel from Colonel Whitmore's care stammered an apology Rachel accepted with a single nod and nothing else. That silence was more devastating than any words could have been. Investigators discovered that Mercer had falsified patient outcomes to inflate his publication record, submitting research to peer-reviewed journals with data he'd invented wholesale. 3 universities that had awarded him honorary doctorates demanded them back. Medical conferences where he presented his findings issued retractions. His network of allies, the colleagues he'd called, the board members he'd influenced, now faced their own investigations for potential complicity. The perp walk happened on a Thursday afternoon at 2:11 p.m. in the physician parking lot beneath the Seattle General sign. News cameras recorded every frame. Mercer wore handcuffs that glinted in autumn sun, his expensive suit jacket draped over his wrists like shame made visible. Reporters shouted questions about patient safety and fraud and how many lives his fabricated data might have endangered. Federal agents guided him into an unmarked sedan, his face a mask of disbelief, a man accustomed to controlling rooms, now powerless in front of them. The chief medical officer issued a formal apology to Captain Rachel Torres, her voice steady but her hands gripping the podium hard enough to turn her knuckles white. The hospital offered full reinstatement, back pay, a formal commendation, even a position in the nursing leadership track. Rachel declined everything except the commendation. Her mission was complete. Colonel Whitmore was stable enough for transfer to specialized care at the VA hospital in Salt Lake City, his breathing tube removed, his lung function improving daily. The classified operation that had placed her at Seattle General was officially concluded. She cleaned out her locker that same afternoon, the one where she'd kept the folded flag hidden beneath her spare scrubs. 13 white stars on a blue field, the memorial flag from her teammate's service at Arlington National Cemetery. She'd touched it every morning before her shift, every single day for 6 months, drawing strength from the weight of it in her hands. The flag folded up small enough to fit in her palm, but it carried the heft of sacrifice and promise. She'd placed it there on day 1 of her assignment, and she'd touched it before walking into a hospital where she was treated like a counterfeit, a fraud, a temporary nurse with purchased credentials. But she'd held her ground. She'd protected her patient. She'd let Dr. Mercer hang himself with his own arrogance. Rachel walked out of Seattle General for the first time through the front doors instead of a side exit, her head high, her hand steady as surgical steel, and nobody called after her because they finally understood exactly who she was. But that wasn't the end of the story. It was only the beginning of what came next. 6 months later, Rachel visited the VA hospital in Salt Lake City where Colonel James Whitmore, she could use his name now, could speak it aloud without compromising operational security, was receiving long-term care and learning to speak again through intensive speech therapy. The vocal cord damage from the traumatic injury had been severe, and recovery was measured in millimeters of scar tissue healing. But he was speaking. His voice came out rough like gravel in a tin cup, but his words carried the same precision and authority they always had. Rachel stood outside the rehabilitation center's sunroom window, watching him work with a speech therapist, watching him attempt the word Afghanistan 3 times before the therapist nodded. Her phone buzzed. A text from her son Marcus. "Mom, are you going to see him? Tell him I said hi." She smiled. Marcus had learned the truth 6 months ago, and instead of pulling away from his mother's double life, he'd stepped into it, understanding now why she'd missed so many soccer games, why she'd carried that weight in her locker, why she'd been willing to lose everything for a patient whose name she couldn't even speak. Through the window of the sunroom, Rachel glimpsed Dr. Mercer in an orange safety vest unloading boxes from a medical supply van in the parking lot. Court-mandated community service. 500 hours of it as part of his sentencing agreement. His hands, which once gestured theatrically during grand rounds while 20 residents smirked, now stacked gauze and tubing under supervision of a warehouse manager who couldn't care less about credentials or reputation. Mercer fumbled with a box. It dropped. Medical supplies scattered across the asphalt like confetti at a funeral. He scrambled to pick them up, moving with none of the confident precision that had once filled a hospital with his presence. His voice carried across the parking lot as he cursed under his breath. Pathetic. Diminished. A man who'd built an empire on lies now unloading boxes for minimum wage and no respect. Rachel turned away from the window. Justice didn't always require courtrooms. She walked inside carrying the folded flag, the 13 stars heavy in her hands despite their lightness. Colonel Whitmore sat in the sunroom facing the windows, his silhouette backlit by November light, his shoulder still in a sling from the nerve reconstruction surgery. His voice was the first thing she heard, rough but functional, each word earned through hours of therapy. "Your boy made me a promise. Baghdad. The convoy ambush en route, Fran. His name wouldn't come out right, so he didn't try. He told me if anything happened to me, he'd bring you home. He kept that promise." Rachel sat beside him, the folded flag on her lap. She'd rehearsed this moment 1,000 times, and now that it was happening, all the rehearsal dissolved. She unfolded the flag slowly, showing him the signatures on the white stripes, 18 names written in permanent marker by Marines who'd held the perimeter that day. Her teammates. Her squad. And one name in larger letters, PFC Marcus Sparrow Torres, her son's best friend, who died holding the line so a convoy could make it through. "He told me you gave the order to hold position until medevac arrived," Rachel said. Her voice didn't waver. It never wavered. That order saved 7 lives. Including mine. The colonel's eyes filled with tears that he didn't try to hide. His hands reached out toward the flag, and Rachel let him touch it, let him feel the weight of it, let him understand exactly what it meant. 3 tours in Afghanistan. 2 under his command. Decisions made at altitude that reverberated through years of lives and losses and homecomings. "I couldn't speak in that hospital," he said, his voice breaking on the last word. "But I saw what you endured. You held your ground. Just like Baghdad. Just like your son." Rachel refolded the flag with ceremony precision, the kind of folding taught to military honor guards, each crease sharp as a knife blade. Hospital corners on a flag. She tucked it carefully. "He would have wanted you to know that what he did mattered. Not just to me. To the entire unit. To the families waiting at home." The colonel nodded slowly, understanding more than she'd said. Understanding that her son had been his best soldier, his most reliable asset, the one who'd volunteered for every mission that mattered. Understanding that she'd inherited that same quality, the willingness to walk into fire for people who couldn't protect themselves. Outside the window, Mercer finished loading the medical supply van. He didn't see Rachel inside. He wouldn't recognize her if he did, because she wasn't the quiet temp nurse anymore. She was Captain Rachel Torres, Special Forces medic, 2-time Bronze Star recipient, once classified operative, woman who'd walked through a hospital wearing a false identity and emerged with her integrity intact. The ones who doubted her were dust now. The ones who'd protected her carried the weight of that decision every single day. Sometimes the bravest warriors carry stethoscopes, not guns. Sometimes they push mops and unload boxes as penance for the lies they told. And sometimes they sit in sunrooms touching memorial flags and understanding finally that competence requires only courage, never pedigree. Rachel stayed for 2 hours. They didn't talk much after that. Didn't need to. The silence between them was the kind that comes from shared fire, shared loss, shared weight of decisions that ripple through decades. When she left, the colonel pressed her hand to his chest, the hand salute of his era, the one that said everything about respect and recognition and finally being seen. Rachel returned the salute. Military precision. No hesitation. No doubt. She walked past Dr. Mercer's medical supply van without looking at it. Didn't need to. He was already forgotten. Just another voice from a hospital that had tried to diminish her and failed. The parking lot smelled like rain coming, that electric smell before a storm hits, ozone, and approaching thunder. Rachel's combat boots crossed the wet asphalt toward her car, and her son was waiting at home with her medals laid out on the kitchen table, asking questions about Baghdad and choices and why she'd been willing to lose everything for a patient whose name she couldn't speak. She'd have answers now. She'd have more than answers. She'd have the one thing no credential could ever grant her, absolute certainty that she'd done exactly the right thing. If you've ever wondered what real strength looks like, it probably looks like this: quiet, steady, unstoppable. Subscribe for more stories about the people the world underestimated and the cost of their courage. Like this video if you'd keep fighting for someone you couldn't even name. Comment below, have you ever been underestimated by someone who didn't know your true value? What would you have done in Rachel's position?